I'm Fredette Richard, the Friends Administrator here at the Hedberg Public Library. And I want to welcome you all to our program this evening as our membership drive gets off to a fresh start for 2012. I want to introduce Ruth Oliver. She's our president of our Friends of HPL. We have several of our board members, Karen Furman, Denise, Irene, Jack, Pat, I'm trying to think, pardon? Terry, yep, they're out in the front there, as far as board members here too. We actually have a full board, and that's kind of nice. It's kind of nice. One of the things that we do, of course, with the Friends of the Library is that we do sponsor a lot of programs, non-budgetary type items that the library doesn't have. For example, our summer reading program, they provide funding for a lot of the prizes that are given to the kids for the summer. You'll see a couple of nice park benches out here in the park. They were provided for by the Friends of the Library. They may buy carts. They'll provide, they provided the funding for tonight's program. Things of that sort, that they always come and ask the Friends if they can help support them. And this board's been really good. They always do find a way to help them one way or the other. So by you becoming a member of the Friends, it obviously helps support the library in the long run. Tonight, very pleased to have a couple of really unique, I guess, speakers with us. Tom McBride, the Mindset List creator and director emeritus of public affairs at Beloit College, and Ron Neef, the professor of English at Beloit College. They'll share the origins of the Mindset List and tell us about their new book, The Mindset List of American History, from typewriters to text messages, what 10 generations of Americans think is normal. In 1998, Tom created the list, which has turned into a globally reported and utilized guide to the intelligent, if unprepared, adolescent consciousness. Please help me welcome Ron and Tom. I guess, Ron, you're going to be up first, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Friends and wonderful group and all you do for the community and for the library. We need to clarify one thing, that Tom's the guy in the tie. He's the professor of English, and I'm the emeritus director of public affairs at the college. Tom would like to be the emeritus professor of English, but actually I've been living off his title now for a few weeks, and it's kind of enjoyable. I get much more respect. We're very happy to be here. Our book, The Mindset List of American History, came out last July, and we celebrated its birth with the Beloit Janesville Symphony Orchestra here in Janesville on July 3rd with the performance of the Mindset Suite, which we use the concept of the Mindset List and the book to create a tribute to those who have served and are serving, and the world that they're serving, and the things that they're fighting for, the things that we hold dear. So we have some very special ties to Janesville beyond the fact that Tom lives here. The philosopher and essayist George Santayana, at the turn of the last century, wrote what's become a cliche: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. A recent Easy Chair column in Harper's Magazine complained that historical illiteracy is a threat to the health of the Republic. That's the scripture from which I draw my sermon tonight. We got to write the Mindset List of American History because since 1998 we've produced an annual list about American college students who were these lists get a lot of attention because they suggest that these students about to enter college with 18 years of experience have generally been untested by perspective. In the now famous lingo of the Mindset List, the students have never dialed a telephone and have always assumed that one could roll up car windows with a push button. We had been working on a book based on the mindset list approach for several years. We developed a manuscript first that described the origins of the list and what we had learned from our experience in producing it. We then tried a second approach with chapters that would be built around the lists we'd create for famous figures throughout history, like Richard the Lion-Hearted, Joan of Arc, and Shakespeare. Then Stephen Power, an editor at the venerable firm of John Wiley and Son in New York, became interested and suggested that we trace the history of what it's been like to be 18 since about the turn of the 20th century in this country. So we wrote a book about 10 American generations, stating that, starting with the one born in 1880, approximately the birth date of our grandparents or great-grandparents, and ended speculatively by looking at the generation born 2 years ago, who would graduate in the year 2026. Over much of the 2 years, we did a great deal of research and back reading, Tom focusing on the journals and the literature of the period, and I was working with the news media in order to discover what would have been on the mindset list for students of the various generations from those graduating in 1898 to 2026. The concept of the mindset list is to come up with a list of items that show how each generation sees the world. 18-year-olds from one entrance year of the college to the next, they change their attitudes, they change their experiences, and we have students that are in their mid-20s seeing the list for people who are 18, telling us that it makes them feel old. Have 18-year-olds always been viewing themselves the same? Always had the same self-image? What would such a survey tell us about American history? What experiences of the past would such a survey reveal, and what would it tell us about today, when so many people seem convinced that the United States is in a unique amount of trouble and that our best days are clearly behind us? We hear that our politics has never been more polarized, that our economic situation has never been more dire, that our children have never been so culturally illiterate, and that our planet has never been more threatened, and that our nation has never been more fractured. Situations made worse by the lineup of noted authorities who, through a rapidly expanding world of digital communication, are able to insert well-researched and independently arrived at elements of fear into our lives regarding medicine, climate change, diet, life expectancy. Their reports are grabbed by exploding media, most of which have a similar agenda as the experts at hand, and a following that is also seeking confirmation over information. Looking forward, therefore, there's not too much to hope for. The world is surely falling apart. We found that our current troubles, along with the prophecies that the American experiment has failed, are hardly unprecedented. Junior, the outlook was grim for Junior in 1900, and he was going to work in the local coal mine or the factory at 14. Wasn't expected to live much past 40. In the teens and 20s, terrorists were blowing up newspapers, bridges, and Wall Street. Uncle Ed was selling apples on street corners in the 30s, and Mom's meat intake came from chewing on the bones after the kids were fed during rationing. Grandpa no sooner got home from World War II than he was shipped out to Korea. The sexual revolution of the 60s and its accompanying politics were regarded as the death knell of civility. By 1980, the United States was coming off a succession of 4 failed presidencies, one of which ended in resignation and disgrace. The war in Vietnam took a political, economic, and military toll that the nation paid for years. The walk to and from school was uphill in both directions. Pretty bad, but while many prominent observers noticed it and proclaimed the end of everything good, most people, and they're the true subjects of our book, just soldiered on. If they thought it was the end of the world, they kept it to themselves. At one point, we wanted to call our introductory chapter, History Has Always Been Us. We believe it's not just those who decide whether to go to war or who set the national interest rates that make history. Ordinary people as groups also make history. They're the ones who fought the wars, typed the letters, attended the protests, bought VHS instead of Beta. They were the first on the block to see to buy a Japanese car. So our book is a biography of 10 generations, aged 0 to 18, who grew up in the U.S. over 150 years. What have we learned from these generations' biographies of ordinary people, of us? First, we learned that paradoxically, one of our strengths in the U.S. may be that we worry all the time, and maybe the national grouchiness is also a national treasure. Second, we learned that youth as a separate culture has not always been with us. Yes, there have always been 18-year-olds, but before 1960, but only after 1960 was there a sense of young people as a breed apart, with their own separate tastes, pocketbooks, technologies, lifestyles, and so forth. This is mostly a post-World War II phenomenon of the teenager. Third, we learned that while high school students in, say, 1931 might have known more about the Battle of Shiloh or the 1876 election than students do today, that they were still quite present-minded in their daily experiences. They were too busy listening to the radio to spend a lot of time imagining what it must have been like before radio. They were too busy fretting about the oncoming Great Depression than to spend a lot of time talking with their grandparents about the Panic of 1893. Fourth, we discovered that there is a great truth to the what Bon Jovi referred to as, it's the same damn song with a different melody, but I guess it's time to roll up our sleeves. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Over 100 years ago, Americans flocked to medicine shows so that salesmen of patent medicines could persuade them to purchase sagwa juice for their nerves and Lydia Pinkham's ointment for everything else. Today, millions of Americans flock to drugstores to buy St. John's wort for their depression and saw palmetto for their kidneys. The Food and Drug Administration has approved none of these. Over 100 years ago, Americans were determined that drinking alcohol was a moral outrage and banded together to stop it once and for all. Today, millions of Americans are determined that raising taxes on the rich is a moral outrage, and they've banded together to stop it. In the 1930s, a determined group of American conservatives argued that the federal government of Franklin Roosevelt was much too involved in American lives and economic freedom. Their representatives on the Supreme Court invalidated federal laws designed to regulate American commerce. Today, a determined group of American conservatives are hoping that their representatives on the Supreme Court will invalidate a federal law that mandates that every American must have health insurance. Around the turn of the century, a determined group of American anarchists set bombs against institutions that they said took away their freedoms. And in 1995 in Oklahoma City, a young anarchist set off bombs there because federal agents had allegedly taken away the freedom of a religious compound in Waco, Texas. When the telephone was invented, critics said it would mean that no one would ever visit anyone in person ever again. And it suggested the ring was the death knell for concert halls and churches. AT&T actually had what they called an application that you could buy that on Monday morning would play for you the recorded sermon from your local church. When the automobile hit the road, critics said it would open every town and village to dangerous strangers. When radio came along, critics said it would end family conversations altogether. TV arrived, and critics said it would mean Johnny could no longer be able to concentrate and he'd go blind. Now that the internet's here, critics say it's fragmenting attention, ending face-to-face conversation, and flooding the population, especially the young, with too much information. 100 years ago, Americans were frantic about the immigrants coming to our shores, and they included not just the nice immigrants of yesteryear, the Brits and the Germans, but now had Italians, Poles, Greeks, Chinese, and of course the Irish. Today we hear from Americans who say it will be over their dead bodies that they'll allow the Star-Spangled Banner to be sung in Spanish, finally giving new meaning to Jose, Can You See? And so it goes. We take no position on the scientific messages of gloom and doom of today, but we've read about the suggestion of legitimate scientists in the late 19th century about trains that would cause the skin to detach from the body once it reached the unholy speed of 75 miles an hour. Scholars and researchers were quick to note that organ failure and blood disease would be the logical outcome of continued alcohol consumption as they advocated prohibition. And many of us can remember the expert testimony of just 40 years ago suggesting there would be no oil left in the ground by 2000 with which to run our cars. We suggest that this generation now entering college will soon be opening up new clinical opportunities as they deal with carpal thumb texting syndrome. We hope someone will remind them that before them came carpal tunnel syndrome from typing, the need for ergonomic chairs to deal with bad backs and knees from sitting in front of computer screens, and the problem of going blind from watching television without a light on in the room, and the Ford fracture that was gained from cranking the Model T on a cold morning. It was all in a day's work. And one has to wonder if today's late-night radio and TV hucksters advancing money-back guarantees on cures from books to bracelets and bromides, or economic solutions from send us your gold to debt management services and reverse mortgages provide enough opportunity for these sons of snake oil salesmen to enrich themselves before appearing in the next infomercials. In the end, we wrote this book for the same reason that we write our annual mindset list at Beloit College, because while we want to document present-mindedness in all its narrowness, above all, we urge that the present be examined in the light of the past. Our hope is that a new generation will have studied enough of the past that they can spot the truth. And there's one other hope that we harbor for our book. One evening years ago, my son brought his college-aged girlfriend home for dinner one night. She was the daughter of a brain surgeon and a prominent lawyer in Washington, D.C. And I was fascinated with the idea of what did they talk about. And I asked her, what kind of conversations they had at dinner. What did they talk about? She responded quite matter-of-factly, I've never eaten dinner with my parents. We hope our book will encourage more dinner and breakfast conversation. Just as the lists each fall have offered faculty an opportunity to break the ice with first-year students in seminars, perhaps we can inspire some conversations, some intergenerational exchanges. We offer icebreakers, such as asking, what was the Kennedy tragedy? What was the day the music died? What did you watch before TV? How did you leave messages before voicemail and email? Why don't they have parades when wars end anymore? Are there any statesmen left? And our critical question, why do thongs come in pairs? With more multi-generational families living and dining under one roof, the chance of pursuing these discussions is enhanced. The Thong reference goes back to Beloit College list of about 4 or 5 years ago that indicated that the students had no idea why thongs came in pairs. It was meant to be humorous until we found out that the Residential Life Office sent out a brochure each year to the students in which they indicated that as resident students living in residence halls, they'd be sharing showers, and they suggested that they bring a pair of thongs for use in the showers. We finally got the Residential Life Office to update their materials. This is similar to a letter that we got from a professor at the Cleveland Conservatory recently, noting that he had one of those what we call mindset moments when he posted a notice on the door leading into the opera studio where he taught that asked students to leave their boots and rubbers outside. Finally, we ourselves have learned that while age has given us wisdom and context, sometimes knowing what 18-year-olds don't know, what it means for something to be bigger than a bread box, for instance, doesn't mean that we're wise. It just means that we're over 30. So we're bullish on America. We're bullish on youth. And I'm going to ask Tom McBride, who has spent 40 years in the classroom talking with this generation, to continue the discussion.
I've really enjoyed this week being the Director Emeritus of Public Affairs at Beloit College, and I'm reminded of something I used to observe years ago when Beloit College used to give out an annual Teacher of the Year award at commencement. And the president of the college would announce the award, the winner of the award, at the end of the commencement ceremony. The cash award at the time was $1,000, which was quite a bit of money then, quite a bit of money now. And the presidents had an odd way of announcing who had won by saying, this year's Teacher of the Year got his Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Kentucky. Well, since only one faculty member in the whole school had gotten his Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Kentucky, everybody knew who the Teacher of the Year was. And you would see faculty members, as soon as that announcement would come on, this year's Teacher of the Year got his BA at the University of Kentucky. All the other faculty members put their heads down like that. But there would always be a few who would imagine that maybe they had gone to the University. Maybe I just forgotten that I went to the University of Kentucky. So, maybe, in fact, I was Director Emeritus of Public Affairs at Beloit College. I've just forgotten. Before I continue, I want to introduce David Easton. David is sitting back there. He's a longtime colleague of Ron's and mine at Beloit College, and he is actually acknowledged in the book. He was one of the people who did some of the early manuscript preparation and editorial work on the book, so we're very, very pleased that David is here tonight. My job tonight is going to be twofold. Number one, I'm going to take you through the book a little bit, give you a very, very quick and dirty overview of the book. And secondly, I want to try to say complimenting what Ron had said earlier, I want to say something about what the book is about at a sort of deeper level, and perhaps indeed theorize as to what sort of nerve the book actually hits. So let me start then with the book itself. The first chapter of the book is called Generations Have Always Had Mindsets. This is something that Ron had mentioned earlier, that one of the things that simply does not change very much from generation to generation is, I suppose, human nature. Growing up, when we are going from 0 to 18, we are, for the first time in our formative years, dealing with the big, bad world. And we are struggling a great deal to sort of find our place in that world, to understand about family and grandparents and the environment around us. And as a result, the things that happen to us in those first 18 years make a very, very, very distinct impression upon us, arguably a greater impression than do events subsequent to our being 18. And that means that every generation is going to be somewhat provincial, going to be somewhat present-minded, is going to be very strongly identified with, and is going to have its identity formed by the events that occurred between 0 and 18. And this is what we mean when we say that generations have always had mindsets. The contents of those mindsets have obviously been quite different from generation to generation. But what does not change is this great present-mindedness, this great provinciality that generations have about what's going on in their first 18 years. This must be more important than anything that has gone on in anybody else's first 18 years, as it were. And we hear this all the time. Tom, Ron, you can't tell me that these students don't know all about the Beatles. Please tell us, Tom and Ron, that these students really do know all about the Beatles. How can they possibly not know about the Beatles? Well, this is, of course, something that is shocking to people of a certain generation, but it should not be at all surprising. So our first chapter, which is an introductory chapter, is called Generations Have Always Had Mindsets. Now, one of the questions that we often get is, what a great idea to come up with high school classes every 13 years. How did you decide on the number 13? And I regret to say, and I can't remember how we decided on the number of 13. It just looked like a kind of nice number, to have. We thought maybe every 13 years enough will have changed so that those generations will be distinct. But this is, in fact, the way the book is organized. And so the first high school class, back in the days when very few people went to high school, and when even the concept of high school was new, is the high school class of 1898, born in 1880. And the title of this chapter is Women Have Always Ridden Bicycles. This was the generation that saw the end of the West, when in fact it was very, very widely understood and assumed that nobody would care anything about the American West in 10 years or 20 years. The West was over. It had been settled. Everything, was completely done. That story had been written. Of course, quite obviously, that particular prediction turned out to be terribly wrong. This was the age when, indeed, a young man who, if he had graduated from high school, could go to a city like Pittsburgh, where twilight was coming earlier and earlier, by the way, thanks to Mr. Carnegie. And indeed, if he had a high school education, he could do sums, he could write memos, he could get a pretty good job. One of his great dreams was, in fact, to have his own horse and carriage someday. And perhaps, indeed, even, in effect, have a house with its own backyard. And there was a book that was written about this time called Acres of Diamonds, which was a good old-fashioned American laissez-faire book that said, you don't have to look for diamonds in South Africa. You can find them in your own backyard if you just have enough get up and gumption. So that was the age when women had always ridden bicycles. This was a time when it was really quite radical for women, in fact, to ride bicycles, and when there was a great bicycle craze in the United States, when people were constantly trying to ride a mile in 2 minutes on a bicycle. Amazing. Imagine that. The next class is the class of 1918. This was the class that was born in 1900, and the title of this chapter is Rum Has Always Been Demonic. This was a generation that could pretty much leave the bicycles behind as a revolutionary form of transportation. The horse and buggy was being replaced by the horseless carriage, and they call them horseless carriages because if you actually look at an early automobile, that's what they looked like. They looked like carriages. They just didn't have horses. This was the age when you might, in fact, buy, if you were about 15 or 16, your father might buy an old tin Lizzie, or a new tin Lizzie, I should say, for Mr. Ford, and throw camphor balls. Are you ready for this? In the tank, in order, in fact, to jazz them up a little bit. This was also an age that was, in fact, very, very much informed by idealism. So if you grew up during this period, there were idealists to the left of you. There was one who wanted to fight a war to end all wars. And then, of course, there were idealists who believed that the only really important question in the world was, are you against the demon rum or are you for the demon rum? This was the period, of course, when high schoolers grew up and saw the formation of what would eventually become the noble experiment of Prohibition. The next class is the class of 1931. It was a very interesting class because it grew up during a time of great prosperity, the 20s, when certain sorts of cultural barriers were being broken, when you had jazz and you had flagpole sitters and you had women who were bobbing their hair. You also had tremendous opposition to modernism. This was also the height of the Ku Klux Klan. There was a tremendous gap between North and South. In 1928, when this particular class was 15, Al Smith, who was Catholic, ran for president, went down to Oklahoma, and was actually picketed by the Klan. So there was this, we think that the cultural wars are new. They're not new. They were very, very much part of the 1920s. Thank you. But in fact, this was a class that grew up with tremendous prosperity until, of course, about the time they graduated from high school, when everything completely fell apart. Wall Street, as the phrase went, laid an egg. And it was an egg which makes our current Great Recession seem like a flesh wound in comparison, as terrible, of course, as the Great Recession that we're going through now has actually been. The next class is the high school class of 1944. I think as we go forward, we'll get closer and closer to some of the people in the room, but I don't think we've gotten to you quite yet. The class of 1944, born 1926. This was, of course, the class that grew up during the Great Depression and also, in fact, were lucky enough, for the most part, not to actually be drafted to fight World War II. Class of 1944. This class is called, the chapter, about this class is called The Shadow Has Always Known. And this is where I get to say that if you know that reference, you probably need to get a life. Or you are a person of a certain age, let's put it that way. I will admit that I am a person of a certain age. When I was a little boy, I used to ask my father, when we would go visit my grandmother in Waco, Texas, on Sunday afternoons, if he would allow me to go into the car, turn on the ignition so that I could listen to The Shadow on the radio. This was sort of the end of The Shadow's reign, and he would always say, no, it'll run the battery down. So I never got to listen to it. But I at least knew something about it. And, of course, this was the a golden age of radio, when you had radios that were bigger than most toddlers were, as it were. And this was, of course, also the age when, indeed, many of the shows had a sort of allegorical depression theme. The bad guys that Lamont Cranston used to track down as the Shadow tended, in fact, to be the wealthy, the malefactors of great wealth back in the days when, indeed, very, very rich people were really hated in the United States during the 1930s. We now come closer and closer to your era, perhaps. This is the class of 1957. This class was born in 1939. The title of this chapter is Fluoride Has Always Been Controversial. This was the class that grew up. Really, this was the class that became the first youth generation. One of the things that Ron and I have discovered with our research is that while there's always been youth, while they've always had their own mindset, they've always been somewhat provincial, youth didn't start thinking of themselves as a separate tribe until the late 1950s, with the advent of two things, rock and roll and great American prosperity. As there was so much money that young people could actually get their own allowances and had their own spending money. And then, of course, it was not long after that that marketers and producers of commercials and products began to realize this is a gold mine marketing group, and we should start marketing to them. And we all know today that indeed all of this has now really gotten, a little bit out of hand. I think, they are so much their separate tribe now. They have their own text speak, they have their own cell phones, they have cable, they have their own websites, they have their own clothes, they have their own lingo. All of this started in the late 1950s with the music that displaced Bing Crosby, and that was also a product of this tremendous prosperity. It was also, of course, a time when there was a great deal of attention in the country over the influence of internal communism, and there were those who believed that indeed fluoride in the water might very well be a scurrilous communist plot. So this is the meaning of the title. Fluoride has always been controversial. The class born in 1952 graduated from high school in 1970. So this is the class of 1970. And the chapter title for this class is Magazines Have Always Been Mad. And this was, of course, the class that grew up to be the vanguard of the rebellious 1960s generation. It all began when they were very, very, very young and were reading Mad magazine with Alfred E. Newman, a very subversive magazine, which ultimately led to protests against the Vietnam War and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and so forth and so on. And I will, in just a moment, read a very brief passage from this chapter in order to give you a sense of our methods. Class of 1983, born 1965, there has always been the Grateful Dead. This is the class that was at the hallmark of what today is called Generation X. They grew up in the bad 1970s, not a terribly happy generation in American life when you had Nixon. As Merle Haggard said in the song, we saw Nixon lie to us all on TV. This was the time of stagflation. It was the time of failed presidencies. It was the time of the Iranian crisis, the hostage crisis in Tehran. Very, very, very unhappy time. And this was a generation that felt they had really missed something. It was like the previous generation of the 60s. They had all the prosperity and they had all the fun. And we went straight to the hangover, in the 1970s. And this was also a time when a lot of the idealism of the 60s died off. One of the items on our list is the 60s that had the idealism of the Beatles. The 70s version of the Beatles was Ziggy Stardust and a hell of a lot of other second and third rate rock bands. Finally, we come closer now to young people today. This particular class is the next one, the class of 1996. It's especially means a lot to me and to Ron because this is also the class of our own sons, born in 1978-79. The title chapter for the class of 1996 is Michelangelo Has Always Been a Turtle. If you are at all aware through your children or grandchildren of those turtles on the half shell, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and I can't remember the last one. But in any case, Michelangelo has always been a turtle. This was a class that, somewhat like the 1920s, grew up in, and the 1950s grew up in a time of great prosperity, the most recent time of the American economic boom. They grew up with the high-tech boom. This was the first generation that, when they were teenagers, began to ask their parents. I can remember this day very, very much in my own household when they said, my son came to me and said, Dad, you know about these things called computers. I think I'm going to get behind in school if we don't get one. This was the generation that, of course, grew up very, very much with the heyday of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the very, very prosperous Clinton years. In fact, I think one of our items on this list is Steve Jobs and Bill Gates have always been in the chips. We then have the class of 2009. This is the next to last chapter. It's also a class that means a lot to me because this is my daughter's class. That's right. Our kids were almost 13 years apart. Great monument to family planning in our family. And this class, the class of 2009, is born in 1991. They've never dialed a telephone. This is the class that is the true first, internet class. This is the first real class of digital natives, digital pioneers. My daughter was in this class. When I learned to type, I took a typing course at 18 in Mart, Texas, at high school. She knew how to type by the time she was 5 or 6 because, of course, she grew up on a computer keyboard. And then the last chapter that we have is a futuristic chapter called They've Never Needed a Key for Anything. This is for the high school class of 2026 and the college class of 2030. Now, one of the things that Ron and I have discovered is that from time to time we write these speculative chapters and we give these speculative talks. And we're always a little bit astonished when we discover that the things we're predicting come true very shortly after we predicted them. I don't think this makes us, seers or anything. I think it's just a question of how, in fact, technology has this sort of inexorable progress. But one of the things that, Ron and I have often thought about is that with digital technology being what it is, things are going to become more and more virtual, and keys are going to simply go by the wayside. We did an interview on Wedgwood Radio shortly after the book came out, and a man called in from Kentucky, from Louisville, who said that he and his wife found a young woman in tears in a Louisville shopping mall. They asked if they could help, and she said, "Yes, you can, perhaps. I can't get into my car. The electronic key is, the battery of the electronic key has died, and I simply can't get in it, and I really don't know what I'm going to do. I'm supposed to meet my boyfriend in 15 minutes. And they explained to her that she could actually use the physical key that was attached to the electronic key. And this was something that she was not, entirely aware of. They also told her she could, get a new battery. But she had to meet her boyfriend, so that's okay. Okay. So this is, in fact, for the class of 2026. I will just very, very, very quickly read you just a few items from that particular class of 2026. Here's number 8. The only network news program they have ever seen is the News Hour with Jon Stewart on PBS. Ron has already mentioned carpal thumb syndrome is a universal malady that afflicts mostly adolescents. Their college textbooks are all online, rented for a semester, and downloaded to their digital readers. This is already, in fact, beginning to happen. They have never changed a light bulb. Few people admit to watching it, but the hot new TV download is the funeral and wedding channel. Most students entering college will never set foot on the campus from which they will graduate. When they vote in their first presidential election in 2028, they will have a week in which to vote online. Now, what I'd like to do is just read you a very, very, very short passage, which will give you a sense of our methods. And somebody that we signed for, I think it's Mary, right, asked us about the Kennedy assassination. How does a book like yours handle the Kennedy assassination? What we, of course, try to do constantly in the book is to write each chapter, not only with the list, which are relatively short, only 50 items, but the narrative of each chapter is written as though it were written in the summer after they have graduated from high school. So each chapter has this kind of present-minded narrative about it. We're, remember, looking at things just a few years back through the eyes of 18-year-olds. So let me just read you this one passage on the Kennedy assassination. Even before the popular advent of Middle Eastern philosophers like Khalil Gibran and contemporary American poets like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, the worldview of this class had changed dramatically on a Friday afternoon in November 1963 when they were in 6th grade. The assassination of President John Kennedy was the most traumatic public experience of their young lives. They had seen pictures of the nice old bald grandfather figure their folks called Ike, but Kennedy reminded them of their still youthful uncle, and he was the only president they had been intensely aware of. He had little kids of his own and was on television all the time, a Cold War Prince Valiant who charmingly called Cuba, Cuba. The folks had been scared at times, especially when the Americans and Soviets had been eyeball to eyeball over Cuba the year before. But they had listened to the president, whom some of them referred to as Jack, and he had reassured them they were okay. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had apparently taken his missiles and gone home. Yet now, right there on television, Kennedy was dead, and then the man who shot him was himself shot while they watched. Class members may have memories 7 years later of what the living room looked like after a long weekend of wrenching TV, a disaster area of empty Coke cans and discarded TV dinners, some with the meatloaf and gravy still sitting there. Most people of any age had been too upset to deal with this domestic catastrophe until after JFK had been buried and a more normal sort of mourning could begin. As 11-year-olds, they had little idea of the politics of the times and of what had or had not been accomplished. They just saw their teachers cry and a nation come to a halt and go into silent sadness. They may have curled up with their copy of Happiness is a Warm Puppy to get through it, contemplating the crises of Linus, Lucy, Pigpen, and Snoopy, but their innocence ended early in that they were like the nation as a whole. So what I would like to do just very quickly in closing, then we'll take some questions, is to talk a little bit about, what I think this book is about and, the reason it hits a certain type of nerve. I think it's mainly because the story that this book tells is a universal story. It is the story which can be summarized in what my beloved grandmother used to say when she would look at me as a little boy and say, Tommy, the saddest story of all is that we get old too soon and smart too late. Regardless of whether we get smart too late, we certainly get old too soon, it seems. And indeed, there is something bittersweet, something very comic, but perhaps somewhat pathetic and tragic about change. Change is an insult. The new generation comes, we become irrelevant, our bodies begin to insult us, the banks of our ambitions and our energies begin to die. We're all in that parade. We're all destined to be in that parade. All you have to do is live long enough and you will be in that parade. Clearly we now have a younger generation coming along. Our generation, depending on where you are in the parade, is coming to an end. Our issues are becoming somewhat forgotten and irrelevant. But I always like to say to my current students at Beloit, who are very young, whom I envy for their youth sometimes, I say, just remember, one of these days, you're going to be old and cranky like me, and you're going to turn to your grandchildren and say, you're lucky. When I came into a dark room, I actually had to flip a light switch. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thanks. I know Ron and I have gone on longer than we intended to, but we get going, we have a lot of fun, especially me, I guess. So do you have any questions that you'd like to ask of us? Yes?
How did
Jack.
you actually put it into a book? Who got that idea, or who came to you?
Yeah, that was Steve Powers' idea. He's a top agent, a top editor in New York. He's with Wiley and Sons, and we had actually struggled. We had an agent who wanted us to put this into book form, but we had struggled trying to figure out how do you take an annual list and put it into the form of a book. Well, it was Stephen who actually came up with this idea. He said, why don't you do a mindset list for generations going back to maybe the time of our great-grandparents.
When you created the book, how did you imagine it would be used, and then how has it been used? How you found it?
Okay. Go ahead, Ron.
It's been kind of interesting, the number of teachers that have approached us recently. This past spring, Tom and I taught several AP American history courses, and we developed a program with the students where they would go and interview parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, put their list together, and then working with their teachers, go into the library and as we do here, put those lists of items, the picture that their parents recalled when they were 18 of the world, and go in and put it into a context by using the original sources and so on. So we've started to develop a teacher's guide to go with the book. We've also developed a
Financial
literacy guide that teaching, this is one of the crises of today, that students have no idea what, there's a great ad on television now, the kid who gets a new bike and he swaps it for an ice cream cone. They have no idea of value and financial literacy, but we're creating a way of teaching that through history of generations. What's the credit, what credit, cash, home ownership, how this has changed.
And by the new year, we have a website called mindsetmoment.com. We're getting revamped, and after the new year, it will be completely revamped, and we'll have both our general guide, our general teacher's guide, as well as our more specific financial literacy guide on that web. It will be at mindsetmoment.com. But the basic idea is that the way you make history fun for 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, is to teach it through the 17-year-olds that existed prior to them, so they begin to get a sense of themselves as historical actors.
I think the other use for it, as we said before, of generations talking to each other. I'm serious about the whole idea that for some of us in this room, we're accustomed. We grew up having breakfast around a table and somebody saying, "Do you know what today is? It's Veterans Day." And we learn things that way, which we don't with kids coming in, grabbing a yogurt and leaving for band practice. So we've lost a lot of that, and our hope is to inspire some of those conversations again.
Anything else?
Somebody asked before about national, we were in the back there, about it's having a national impact, that it is not, how you do this with more than a regional tone to it, and it's been kind of interesting in the last 2 years. It's taken on a very international tone. We get interviewed by one amazing afternoon being interviewed by reporters in Cape Town, South Africa, and Hong Kong, just on a cell phone, which is one of those changes that you don't think about until it happens. And last year we were viciously attacked by Fidel Castro in a weekly column that he wrote, where he noted that because of our book was that we were describing an American educational system that had 8,000 warheads pointed at Cuba, and how the American system had failed because students in this country thought that Beethoven was a dog. And we were very complimented by the fact that he took the time to. However, we found out later through diplomatic sources who wrote to us and said that they apologized. Castro had been misinformed by local media.
His argument was that we were spending so much on warheads targeting him that we failed to educate our students as to who Beethoven really was. Those of you who remember the Beethoven movies with St. Bernard, that generation had come up that year, so we said, you know, Beethoven's always been a dog. I think Fidel was taking it a little bit too literally. Yes, sir.
How profitable has this book been, and how many copies have you sold, and where do you sell it?
It's available, first of all, as to how profitable it's been. We've got a nice advance check. We have yet to get a royalty check.
Actually, our limousine is outside.
What's that?
Our limousine is outside.
Our limousine is outside, right, exactly. It's available, you know, it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstores, and, you know, it's available everywhere. You won't have any trouble, you know, buying a copy, although I think you've already bought a copy. But as for how many copies it sold, one of the things we've learned is that it's very hard to say because you can go on something called Author Central. Amazon will let you on there for your book, not anybody else's book, but your book. And it will give you some sense of how many copies have been sold, but it doesn't include Kindle or Nook or library copies or independent bookstore copies or trade show copies. So it's really not a terribly reliable guide, as it were. But so far, you know, we think probably about 6,000 to 7,000 copies.
But it's interesting that as we've been doing, during October, we did about 25, 30 interviews around the country, radio interviews on a radio tour. And Tom, who's become very facile at this, was able to track down actual communities where we would speak, and we'd see this spike in book sales. So, you know, some of that conversation, you know, certainly helps. There was a story this past week of the author of The Exorcist, who wrote the book, and it languished for months, selling no more than 2,000 or 3,000 copies, and it was just going no place until one night. If you remember, Dick Cavett used to have a night, an evening talk show that ran against Johnny Carson, and it was a much more intellectual show. He'd have a guest on and talk for an hour. Well, his guest canceled out that night, and they got in touch with this guy and said, are you free? You want to talk about something? He went on, talked about his book, and of course it became the #1 bestseller of just about the decade. And so we're just waiting for...
Yeah.